Then there's California, a podcast featuring members of the California State Senate Democratic Caucus in conversation about their lives, legislative priorities, opinions, and viewpoints that help make California exceptional. From the state capitol in Sacramento, I'm Brian Green. After 2 years of often intense and emotional public hearings, the California Reparations Task Force at the end of June sent the governor and the legislature a 1,000-page document that included more than 200 recommendations for how to undo centuries of unfair treatment for Black Californians. In addition to the recommendation of cash payments to those whose ancestors were enslaved, the report also compels California to formally apologize for its shameful encouragement of white supremacy through the generations. So now that this historic reparations document is in the hands of the state's leaders, what happens next? All eyes are on us. But will California make reparations for Black residents a reality? Well, on this edition of Then There's California, we'll review the creation, significance, and potential impact of this unprecedented official gesture of racial reparation and healing. And we'll hear the reactions and perspectives on the subject from the two Senate members of the California Legislative Black Caucus. Senators Stephen Bradford and Lola Smallwood-Cuevas represent neighboring districts in Southern California. Senator Bradford's 35th Senate District includes the cities of Watts, Inglewood, and his hometown of Gardena. Senator Smallwood-Cuevas' 28th Senate District includes a large part of downtown Los Angeles and South L.A. and West L.A. Both lawmakers have joined me separately on this podcast this past spring, but it's a privilege to bring them back now to hear their observations and reflections at this remarkable moment of reparations discussion and hopefully action. We'll speak with Senator Bradford first. Senator Bradford is a former chair and now vice chair of the Legislative Black Caucus and has been since 2020 one of two legislative appointees to the California Reparations Task Force. Welcome back, Senator Bradford. How are you?
I'm doing well.
The Task Force on Reparations released its report after a couple of years of intense debate and conversation, public input. Let's reflect really on the historical significance of this report, not only for this state, but for this nation, and really for you as a lawmaker, as a Black man. What did you take away from this experience for the last 2 or 3 years being a member of this task force?
What I took away is how little I know or the rest of the country knows about slavery and the debt that it owes to those individuals who toiled in the field for over 250 years and were brutalized. And it's a lot of horrors that have never been shared. And I think this report exposes all of that and lays ground to how we arrived at where we are today as a state and a nation. And it was because of slavery.
Reparations has been talked about for decades. California now is the first state to attempt this, to even get to this point. Speak in the macro level of this impact on the country and this state that we not only just talking about it, we've actually produced a report now.
I think we've shown the rest of the nation what not only should be done, but can be done if you're committed to addressing America's original sin, which is slavery. And we have whitewashed the story for far too long, and I'm excited about what's in the report, but I'm also a realist to know that there's going to be challenges here, and getting my colleagues and other folks across this country, or should I say the state and this nation, to accept this as the gospel. But it's true, and it's no fiction in this report. Everything in this report is factual, and it speaks to how we arrived at where we are today as a country.
Well, speaking about how we arrived, before we get into the details of what's in this report and the recommendations, I want to put the task force work in the context of California's early history as a free state, admitted to the Union in 1850. But far from being a state where everybody got an equal chance, California embraced slavery from the outset and used it to become the most prosperous state in the nation. Slavery continued to be openly practiced. Southern slave owners would bring their slaves here and sell them into working in the gold mines and on the plantations. We upheld the fugitive slave laws. In fact, a lot of what we did here led to the Dred Scott decision by the U.S. Supreme Court. And you kind of mentioned this, how much you said you didn't know. Are you surprised how many Californians don't know this dark history of their exceptional state, and that the history of slavery is right here beneath the surface of what we thought we knew?
I can't say I'm surprised because America has lied from the beginning as to who we are as a country and how we got here. I mean, all you have to do is look at our Constitution and our Declaration of Independence, and it speaks to the fact that this country was designed for white men. And women weren't even considered. And if you were black, you were considered 3/5 of a human being. So we were never really factored into the equation. So to understand that history and understand what rural California, like I say, we've been miseducated. And as I've often stated, there are stories that made America, then there's stories that America's made up. Much of what we've taught is what America's made up. And this report spells it out clearly of what made America, and it's the blood, sweat, and tears and sacrifices of slaves here in California too, who were brought here. And like I say, if you were a woman slave and had a child, that child was born a slave here in California. As you mentioned, the fugitive slave law, if you ran away to California, you had the slave hunters who would return you back to the state and the plantation which you ran away from. So
Right.
We were just a free state in name only, not in practice. And a lot of folks don't know the first governor of this California not only owned slaves, was a devout racist and wanted to eradicate African Americans from the state entirely.
Well, you have spent the last couple of years on this task force. Let's talk about some of the dynamics of the task force and the work that you had on your shoulders, you and your colleagues, your legislative representatives, and the rest of the task force, asking this task force to examine the effects of a 400-plus year legacy of slavery and discrimination just in 2 or 3 years. That's a monumental task for all of you to do this in such a quick time. Do you wish you'd had more time?
Without a doubt, we wish we had more time. Don Tamaki, who's the only non-African American on the task force, was part of the Japanese reparations task force almost 40 years ago, and they had 3 years, and they were dealing with their harms to about 100,000 people, and he says 3 years was not enough. I commend and laud the DOJ for being able to turn this around in such a tight time frame. I mean, yes, we could have spent another 2 years just doing a deep dive into the effects of slavery that's still having impact on today. So a lot of work done in a short period of time. But again, I commend the dedication of the task force members who took the work very seriously. And again, Department of Justice, who did an outstanding job in helping us move along at this breakneck speed.
Not to get too inside baseball about this, but there were some comments in the media that the creation of the reparations process wasn't pretty, that the hearings were often an exercise in turmoil was the description, but that ultimately you had a historically unprecedented job. And you did it.
Yeah.
And then, of course, I know you got threats from the public, angry people that wanted more right now, immediately, write us a check before we leave the room kind of thing. Reflect on that just as you've worked through these last couple of years.
I mean, it was frustrating at times, but again, I understand the anger and the desire for people to express and emote their feelings and frustrations because, again, you've had 400 years of oppression in this country. And so people have a right to be angry, but also you have a group who are opposing slavery because they have been lied to as well, and they fail to understand the benefits that they enjoy today. You can really trace back to slavery in many ways. When you talk about individuals who are large landowners in this state and in this country that own land for 100 plus years, trust me, slavery had something to do with it.
Right.
And denying home ownership and land ownership for African Americans only afforded those opportunities to non-blacks, and they failed to understand they benefit from that. I mean, even from homesteading and land grants that free slaves were denied, they were able to take advantage of that. So I understand the frustration, but people need to know the history, and I think that's part of the frustration because we've been miseducated for so long in this country.
Well, and not to mention a deeply ingrained mistrust of government over the generations, and looking at this task force that is formed by the government and, okay, what are they actually going to do? How are they going to let us down this time?
I agree. I mean, I don't fault him at all for being a little bit skeptical and angry, I should say, at the whole process. But I think it was well debated, and we had a lot of good information, and we learned a lot, not only from many of those folks who came there demanding payments right now, but, from the economists and all the folks who participated in this, it was a takeaway for us to all to learn and improve the product of the final report.
Let's discuss the product. One of the things that you considered, which was the nucleus of a lot of the debate and a lot of the press, really part of the heart-rending process, was who should be eligible for restitution, including cash payments, and how much. Should it be descendants of enslaved Black Americans or all Black Californians, regardless of lineage, and even agreeing to address the issue of reparations for immigrants of color versus just natural-born citizens? How did you ultimately come together, and what was the recommendation on this?
The recommendations were those who were descendants of chattel slavery, who were here in the United States prior to the 20th century. And that was the intent of the author, Dr. Shirley Weber. So I clearly followed her lead in understanding the community of eligibility, and it should be those individuals whose families gave their lives working for free for hundreds of years in this country and were separated from their homeland, having their native language stripped from them, their religion, all of those things, and be indoctrinated into an American culture that didn't want them to begin with. So, no, we were very specific on who should be eligible. Yes, have people of color who arrived since the end of slavery suffered as well due to the Jim Crow and discrimination and all of those things. Yes, those are valid arguments, but who should be at the top of the pyramid if it's going to be reparations, or those folks who can clearly trace lineage back to chattel slavery here?
Well, as you mentioned, you are a realist, and you have been very specific about pointing out to California that don't expect the checks to be written right now. Mm-hmm. And reparations can also come in many other forms other than payment. How are you going to address that, and what are some of the other forms of non-payment reparations that the task force recommends? I
mean, we're talking about something that could very well model the GI Bill, where you have ongoing health care, continued education, home buyer assistance, ongoing child care for those folks that need it, state tax relief or forgiveness for a period of time. I mean, it's a lot of ways that we can compensate folks outside of a check. And again, I try to stress to folks, reparations was never about money. It was about land. It was about 40 acres. And if we can assist folks in becoming homeowners or acquiring land for business or something, I think that's a win-win, because a lot of folks fail to realize generational wealth is very rarely passed along through cash. It's through land. It's through property. And that's how many of non-African Americans have built generational wealth. At the same time, African Americans were denied home ownership for so long, denied the right to own land. And even when they acquired land, this government found a way to steal it back from them through eminent domain and urban renewal and all those other things that you very rarely saw in a white community.
Reading in the Erica Smith, the Los Angeles Times columnist this morning, you even came up with this novel idea with, we're closing prisons. What are we going to do with that land? How about give it back to the people who had much of this land stolen from? Fantastic idea.
I think so, but, we'll see. And again, especially when probably the majority of the folks who, again, were incarcerated and had to work in a prison labor system, I'm pretty sure they would like to go back and do something positive on that land now and change the narrative.
I think about if irony is the right word, I don't know, that addressing the centuries-long circumstance where Black men and women had a price tag on their bodies and their souls and were sold for their bodies and their labor. And here you are, all these centuries and generations later, having to put some sort of dollar figure or symbolic dollar figure on how to pay these survivors of generations with some form of meaningful restitution. I mean, that's just hard to do.
True. That's why we work with some of the leading economists in this country to, help formulate what that number would be. And I think our starting point was the wealth gap. And it was clearly identified, the wealth gap between African-American families and white is about $360,000. So I says that should be the floor at where we start. But we could be here all day talking about the millions, if not trillions, of dollars that it would cost to make folks whole, and we know we can't afford to do that. But there is something we can do. I mean, and I've always stated that if this is going to be a priority, it has to be in the budget, whether it's for cash payments or just stand up to programs that need to be implemented.
Other task force recommendations were a formal apology from the state of California and this creation of a new centralized state agency to oversee in the subsequent years the rollout, so to speak, of these recommendations. And essentially it would be the state of California publicly apologizing for a tremendous harm and disservice for what has happened. So is that exactly what's going to happen? You're hoping that the state can apologize?
I hope so. I mean, just like Ronald Reagan apologized for the internment of Japanese Americans over 40 years ago. I think if we're really talking about atoning for the wrongs, you first have to apologize. You can't begin healing of any sort without first apologizing. So that's first and foremost. Is apology in itself enough? No, but it's a start. And it's an acknowledgement that, you have wronged and you harmed someone, and this nation has harmed folks. So for this state, this governor, to formally apologize, I think would be a great starting point.
And then a state agency that would follow through on this, right?
Yes, and yes, we have to stand up some type of state agency, whether it's a standalone or is it, incorporated into an agency or a department that's already existing. But we definitely need a division of something to manage and identify who, one, is qualified for it or eligible for reparations, and again, how do you administer and provide those resources going forward. So yes, it will require some governmental agency or department to do so.
Maybe or maybe not, to your surprise, you have had to kind of walk through, educate, carry your colleagues, Black and otherwise, through this process of letting them know how important reparations is and what the task force will do. Do they take this seriously? Are they behind you? Do they back this as policy?
We haven't had that great of discussion in depth with many members outside of the California Legislative Black Caucus. All 12 members of the Legislative Black Caucus take this issue very seriously. To what degree our other colleagues will do it, we'll see soon once we start introducing legislation. But I use a indicator of a piece of legislation we had last year, ACA 3, which would have ended involuntary servitude in our prisons, and we couldn't get that passed. And here we are in 2022 last year, and we're talking about 160 years after slavery, and we still want to leave that in our Constitution. So if that's any indication that it's going to be a tough road to hoe, I think that's a prime example. There's going to be some resistance from our colleagues, even those with D's behind their name. And
Legislative Black Caucus is in sync on moving forward with this, is supportive of the report.
We're standing tall, and we'll start a working group comprised of myself and Assemblyman Reggie Jones Sawyer to start weeding through the recommendations and see what we can present to Ledge Council that we can shape into legislation that all 12 members will carry some type of legislation addressing reparations.
Well, obviously, the results expectation on this is high. What's a realistic timeline where Californians will start seeing something manifest into legislation related to the recommendations?
I mean, it could happen this year, but I'm not betting on it. I think Mr. Jones Sawyer has a vehicle available to insert language in before the end of this legislative year, but to really do it right and really dissect the final report and have a chance to really shape it, I think the real legislation will be part of the 2024 legislative year, where you'll probably see a slew of bills trying to address, the variety of recommendations in the final report.
Speaking of Assemblymember Reggie Jones Sawyer, you and Assemblymember Jones Sawyer are termed out this next year. You're in your last 2 years of office. Notwithstanding, obviously, what's going to be your continued influence and involvement in politics and community and policy here in the state, even outside of the legislature, do you wish that you could personally have more hands-on chance to work on this? A few more years would be really helpful. Is that how you feel? Or are you of the belief that, hey, I was part of this task force. I've been here since the beginning. I've lit the fire. The rest of you can toke the flames for the incoming years. How do you feel about that?
I mean, yeah, I would love to serve longer, regardless of this issue in front of us, but at the same time, you can still impact policy without being elected. And I try to tell folks, I say one of the most effective politicians this country ever knew was Dr. Martin Luther King, and he was never elected to anything. So the fact that I will be gone come 2025 doesn't stop the work that I can do to advocate and educate my former colleagues as to what needs to be done. And so, yeah, you can still be effective and you can still have an impact without necessarily still being in the legislature. But I think even if I had another 10 years, it would still be not enough time, I should say, to address all the wrongs related to slavery. And so it would still be a lot of work to be done.
Absolutely. You and your colleagues in the Legislative Black Caucus have a lot of work to do in both educating your colleagues, your other colleagues, and California and the public at large, and even inspiring the public at large about this process and helping people understand that reparations is not about individual guilt, but it's actually the political responsibility of a society at large. How do you feel about that?
No, it's not about, you're right, individual guilt. It's about a nation reckoning and owning up to their responsibility. If we're the land that we claim to be, the country that we claim to be, that all men are created equal and they are bestowed certain unalienable rights, then they should befall on blacks as well as whites. It is an education process. A lot of folks don't want to know the truth, and for some that know the truth, they're still in denial of feeling that this is so long ago, get over it. No, we don't tell our Jewish brothers and sisters to get over the Holocaust. We don't tell our Armenian brothers and sisters to get over the genocide. We're now realizing we're telling our Native Americans to get over the Trail of Tears. So quit telling black folks whose ancestors lost their lives, toiled in the fields for hundreds of years to grow this nation, to get over it, because we're still being impacted today. And even the recent Supreme Court ruling speaks to the fact that race is still a factor here. And the people who are being impacted the most are, again, African Americans.
California's making history with this reparations task force and this report. What lessons have been learned through this experience that you and your colleagues have had that can be imparted to other states or even the nation as a whole if similar reparations task force were to be formed in another state? What could they learn from this experience from the last couple of years?
That it's painful, but it needs to be had. That discussion needs to be had. The research and this understanding needs to be shared of how this nation became the great country that we are today. A lot of it is directly tied to slaves. Having folks work for free for all those years, and a lot of folks think we just snapped our fingers and, we're the leading economy in the world simply because we work harder and we try harder. No, you had free labor for 250 years. So I think folks really need to understand that, and they don't. And that's probably the biggest takeaway, is how little we actually do know, and the unwillingness to accept it, and for folks to continue to say, again, I didn't own slaves, or I'm not a racist. This is not about being a racist. It's about understanding how we got to where we are as a nation. The laws that we have in place were clearly centered around folks that were enslaved, and then shaping those laws once these folks were free to continue to suppress them, hold them down, to keep them from owning homes, again, over-incarcerating them. And I think if they really look at slavery as a whole and Jim Crow and desegregation and all those things that followed, it will lead them to where we are today and how we got here. So it's just an understanding of that.
Indeed. Final question. Reverend Al Sharpton has said that even if there were never a payout of reparations in hard cash, putting a price tag on injustice is a worthy exercise, at least to force an examination and a discussion of history and push back against the racism deniers that we still have even here in the 21st century. He said that once we get mainstream America to at least say, yes, we owe them, then you'll have a better discussion on how we pay. But we still have to get a mainstream America to come to that question, do we owe?
Without a doubt. It's about, again, recognizing the truth and accepting it for what it, well, not even accepting, but understanding that it exists and acknowledging it. Like I say, a lot of folks want to stick their head in the sand and not deal with it. But racism and slavery is something that we should have had a discussion on a long time ago. And it's a shame, again, we find ourselves almost 400 years from its inception, 160 years since the ending of slavery through the Emancipation Proclamation, that we're still having a debate on this. It's long overdue. Its time has come. And so I agree with the Reverend Al Sharpton that discussion in and of itself is not enough, but it's a great start. It's a great awakening, and it's a great awareness.
I'm grateful to you for having this discussion on this historic day here in California to see this report. Applaud you for all your work on the task force and your work here as a lawmaker. And I hope sooner than later, you in particular for the work that you've done, and California can see the fruits of some of this labor from this task force. So thanks for joining us. Really appreciate it.
I think we will all benefit from the work here. Yes, reparations is about blacks who were slaves, but I think if we start removing those barriers and biases and racism, it's going to benefit all Americans. And that's what I hope we benefit from this in the long run.
Senator Stephen Bradford of Gardena, the vice chair of the Legislative Black Caucus and a legislative appointee to the California Reparations Task Force. Senator Lola Smallwood-Cuevas is in her first year in the California State Senate. Senator Smallwood-Cuevas is an educator, a labor organizer, and community leader, and is the co-founder of the Los Angeles Black Worker Center, which worked to increase access to quality jobs, reduce employment discrimination, and improve industries that employ black workers, black women workers in particular. Welcome back, Senator Smallwood-Cuevas.
Thank you so much, Brian. Good to see you.
It has been said that only by acknowledging the full extent of slavery's grasp on U.S. society, its intimate connections to present-day wealth and power, and the depth of injury to millions of black Americans, can we begin to reconcile the current disparities and paradoxes of American life. And so, to that point, give us your assessment of this historical significance of this report for what you call the new moral majority out here in California and the world that possibly can see this deserved justice and get a reward from it.
Well, I want to just say how incredibly proud I am of our task force on reparations and the phenomenal job that they have done. I don't know if you got a chance to see the book.
It was like 1,000+ pages, something like that?
It is. I mean, what a historical record that will be generative, not just for California and, as you said, the country and the world. California is the first state to take this question on about how do we address some of our original sins that have seeped into the fabric of our society, into the fabric of our institutions, and to really think about what are the ways that we can repair some of that harm directly to the Black community, but also for all of California, because this is one of the unique moments in time where we are a people of color majority. And I like to say the new moral majority.
Yes.
That can really look at this whole question of reparations, and think about it in terms of a new start for our state, a new start for our country that recognizes the sins of the past, that recognizes the intergenerational harms, and to say that we are sorry for that and we want to start anew. We want to engage in a future where this travesty will be addressed. And it's freeing and liberating for all of us when we do that. And so for me, I'm so excited to be a part of this legislature, and particularly this leadership, and Black leadership in particular, to take on this sacred work. The sacred work of saying that we want to make amends for the harms of the past, because we know it's about creating a brighter future ahead. So this, for me, in terms of this question of the impact, so personal. My family came from the tobacco farms of North Carolina. My great-grandmother, her mother was a slave. When I look at her headstone, she was born just 9 years after slavery ended. Wow. And to know that history is part of your family. And I come from a place where there are white Smallwoods and black Smallwoods in North Carolina.
Sure.
And my mother was the first, and I often say this, I consider myself almost first generation, because she grew up in a segregated school reality. She couldn't choose where she wanted to go to school. I had that luxury of freedom, but certainly along the way, all of the institutional barriers and challenges exist for so many families who had that experience, and that this opportunity of reparations helps us to face it, to take it on, and to say, as Black Latinx, API, LGBTQ, Jewish, white community members, that we are about making sure that we move forward in a way that brings all of us together. And honestly, the rest of the world is watching us. This task force used the framework of the United Nations to really look at how our state should examine, interrogate this question of reparations, and very thoughtful in terms of what's necessary. And one is those that were harmed, that we acknowledge and make an apology for that. Two, we look at what was the depth of the harm, what were the institutional challenges and barriers that it caused. And then three, how do we make sure that we put in place systemic changes and individual acknowledgments that say these harms will not be repeated, they won't happen again. So California has just done a remarkable job in terms of the seriousness of this exploration. Statewide, there were countless hearings and discussions that were had, multiracial audiences, Black community members having the opportunity to really share their traumatic and personal stories. And in the end, 95 recommendations on what are the steps that we can take to summarize 400 years of oppression, institutionalized racism, and to come out with 95 steps is truly remarkable. And I look forward to working with my colleagues in the legislature to take each one by one and figure out what are the ways that we build a pathway to transformation and a new era, an era in which California has made amends and we're able to move forward.
You mentioned the apology that would be required or suggested, recommended as part of the reparations, but you also mentioned that apology should come with a promise. We apologize for what has happened. We promise to do our best to not let something like this happen again.
So I think the promise is in what we talk about here in the state. We talk about equity. We talk about opportunity. We talk about those that are most disadvantaged, that have overlapping barriers. The promise is that we are wanting, willing, and able as a state, and I'm speaking for the constituents of the 28th district, that we want to unpack what that means. What does it mean to explore and delve into things like education, public health, mental health, economic justice, environmental impacts? What does it mean for us to really explore those issues, but using a lens that recognizes the root causes of so many of the crises that we're facing? Coming from my background, having worked organizing with low-wage, marginalized communities, I know that many of the challenges that we face, be it housing or employment, are rooted in a history of failed public policies that were racialized, race-driven, and that unfortunately drove so many communities into the margins and into crisis. So this is an opportunity for the state to say, now we have recommendations. Now we have a path forward to really go and unpack these crises and find at the root of it that historic reality that we now can say we want to address. And I want to say that when California moves forward, not just in presenting the task force findings, but in terms of our policies, in terms of the alignment between all three parties, the Assembly, the Senate, and the governor, when we do that, we are setting the tone for the rest of the nation. And other states are watching us. Our success is on the success for the country to finally get at the root and to answer these questions. How do we make the repair from a system that held families through the generations in bondage and created the world's wealthiest economy, the strongest nation, because of the intergenerational 300 years of slavery, and adding to that segregation, another 100 years of Jim Crow? That is remarkable for the state to actually sit with that truth and to work through it, and to work through it from our multiracial position, our position as the most diverse state in the nation, that as we, as a people of color majority, can sit and have this conversation and really get at these root causes and say, we are going to move forward in a way that acknowledges and repairs the harm. It is a phenomenal time in the state of California to go through this exercise. And we're going to go through it together through the democratic process. And our state and our country will be better for it.
I was deeply touched by your comments when we spoke earlier this spring about coming to the California State Capitol, working as an elected lawmaker in a building that was not built for the representation of Black Californians, and seeing portraits on the wall of men who do not look like you, and many of whom did their part to repress or discriminate against Black Californians. And I think it's important to remember that in the context of California's early history as a free state. Far from being a state where everybody got an equal chance, we embraced slavery from the outset. We used it to become the most prosperous state in the U.S. We look at California as such a diverse state, but a lot of people in this state don't know some of its sordid or dark past. Even though we were a quote-unquote free state, we contributed a lot to the problem of slavery and oppression.
That's right. I mean, we compare ourselves now to other states and we say California is the shiny state on the hill in so many ways. But there are many folks, and I have heard my own constituencies, when it comes to our understanding and recognition and intentional focus on things like Black homelessness and incarceration rates and unemployment rates. Some refer to us as the shiny Mississippi. And that's something California has to hold, right, in terms of the ways in which we've addressed this issue of race. I come from Los Angeles. The founder of Los Angeles, Biddy Mason, was a slave who had to walk behind the stagecoach of her owner, who brought her from the South to California. And it just so happened that she learned that California was a free state, but she was actually acting and working as a slave in this state under her master who bought her here. And she had the wherewithal to file for her freedom and her petition, and ended up being one of the founders of the city of Los Angeles, one of the first landowners, built the first AME church, began this whole notion of childcare, and began a very rich history of Black people in this state. But her story in terms of coming as a slave and being treated as a slave in the state of California can be recognizable for many generations. I think about the Crenshaw district, where some folks have called parts of my district, the middle class areas, the Black Beverly Hills, mainly because Black entertainers could not live on the west side in the places where they were performing. Folks like Ray Charles, Mary Wells, the Supremes, they had to, because of segregation and covenants, racial covenants, were forced to live in this particular area and could not cross over into the west side. Housing covenants, redlining, tremendous wealth. Bruce's Beach, the most recent example, and the stories go on. And when you look at workers, for example, Black folks up until the 1970s, 89% of janitors were Black in Los Angeles.
Yes.
Those were the only industry that Black folks could hold. And through civil rights movement, those industry began to open up. But that was after decades, generations of wealth being built by other communities. So when we think about California, we have to remember we are still part of the United States of America. And unfortunately, a lot of the bigotry and racism and segregation, be it in land and occupation and access to health care, clean air and water, all of our communities have experienced those roots of racist division, and is really an accounting for, fast forward into the 21st century, a lot of the crises that we're seeing now. Mm-hmm. It is not surprising to me that 40% of Black folks sleep on the street at night, even though they represent only 7% of my county, or here at the state, 5% of the state. It is not lost on me that 45% of folks in our county jail are Black, 30% in our prisons. Though we make up such a small percentage of the population, it's not lost on me that my Black constituents in LA County die 17 years sooner than other residents in my county because of the disparate treatment that is rooted in a history in which Black folks were not allowed to be human beings. I own this table. This is my table, and whatever I want to do to this table is okay. That is the position that Black folks were in. And as they moved from North Carolina and South Carolina and Texas, and as those segregationists also moved west, those values drove a lot of the policies that we are struggling through today. And that's why I often say, why is California, why is this so important for California when we have a multiracial community, is because we want to say no more. We don't want to have any community exposed to the conditions that come from a situation where a human being is not valued just because of who they are. This is an opportunity for us to delve deep into that history, and the outcome of it will be felt not just by Black people, but by all people in the state of California. Because if we don't allow addressing the institutional impacts of slavery on Black communities, then we will allow those conditions to continue and fester and consume other folks. So I want to lift up work because that's where I come from.
Yes.
So when you look at the agricultural workforce, when you look at the janitorial workforce, when you look at the home care workforce, when you look at the car wash workforce, these were jobs that have been held by people in bondage, then those folks in Jim Crow by Black citizens. And even though other groups have now come to take on those jobs, they continue to work in a situation where the jobs are inhumane, where they are not supporting families, where they are creating an economic hardship and crisis, where folks are barely able to survive. That is a legacy of slavery. Home care was domestic work, and domestic work was a Black person's work that was rooted in slavery. So we can draw the lines between what is happening today and what is rooted in the history of slavery in that economic system that globalized. The first time we really jumped into a globalized marketplace was in slavery, and how dangerous it has been for the Black community and how dangerous it is for all of us as we deal with the legacy of that history. That's what reparations, that's the opportunity that reparations presents for all of us to learn, to explore, and to find the fixes that we need to make sure that our society can move forward and that we can break some of the crisis and some of the horrific conditions and disparities that far too many folks are living in that are rooted in the Black experience in the state.
Senator Bradford will be termed out next year. You, Lord willing, should you choose, will be around a while to perhaps see the fruit of this labor, to see some of the recommendations become reality legislatively, policy-wise. Hopefully you'll get to see that. Are your colleagues inside and outside the Black Caucus, are they supportive of this? Are they in sync with you and the recommendations and what could potentially happen? They may be talking the talk, but are your colleagues in the legislature walking the walk and say, we're with you, we want to see this become reality?
Well, I have to say that in the Senate, there has been great support for the task force completing this process, delivering on the recommendations. But, you know, every policy, and particularly a policy this big and this important, we're going to need every single legislature member, staffer to roll up their sleeves and to make sure that California leads the way and how a state needs to do this work. What we want to make sure that we understand is that the state made a commitment to this under the leadership of our Secretary of State, Shirley Weber. The legislature agreed to take this mantle on. Our governor has spoken in support and being ready to receive the policies that come out of this process. So my expectation is absolutely we have a legislature that is ready to go to work. They understand why this is important. They understand that the eyes of the world are on the state of California, and we are the state that we say we are. We are a people of color majority. We represent a nation state, the fourth largest economy in the world. And if any state can make sure that reparations is done well and that is done in a way that uplifts all of our residents and our citizens, it's the state of California. So I look forward to working with all of our colleagues, the API caucus, the LGBTQ plus caucus, the Latino caucus, the Women's caucus, the Jewish caucus, and all of my colleagues, the Progressive caucus, all of my colleagues in and around the state capitol to make sure that we do the work that the state of California has asked us to do. And that is to make sure that California leads the way on this critically important, historic policy that will live on for generations and generations.
Final question. In our previous conversation earlier in the year, you talked about witnessing the power of what Dr. Martin Luther King and Reverend James Lawson, one of Dr. King's peer travelers and the lead clergy at Holman United Methodist Church, which I think might be in your district, in fact.
Yes, it is. And he's turning 95 very soon.
Yes, hard to believe that. You called it the soul force, this power that we have, this divinity that we have to make significant, transformative change, and that your faith in California would reach higher ground based on that soul force. So looking at that, is this task force report and what could potentially happen with it and the debate it will spur and the discussion, is that part of that soul force in your mind? Absolutely. This is soul force work. This is a sacred process that we are about to embark on. I don't take the loss of life, the blood, sweat, tears, all that has gone into generations of Black community, African Americans in the struggle for liberation and freedom. And when Black people are free, we all get free. And that is a proven fact. So this is absolutely soul force work. It will put California on higher ground, and it sets a pathway for other states across this great nation to also interrogate this issue of slavery and figure out ways that we can bring in a collective opportunity for justice and for all of us to reach that higher ground. So I absolutely know that not just Reverend James Lawson, but I know Dr. King, I think about Ella Baker, I think about all of the freedom fighters who have fought against oppression, rooted in chattel slavery, to see this generation, to see all of us at this moment looking, using our own soul force, using our own moral compass, and using the good policy lens that we have to make determinations that will allow California to be freer than it is now after we adopt and pass these recommendations for reparations. So I look forward to a freer California, and I look forward to all of us reaching higher ground through this important legislation. It's a privilege to talk to you about this. I'm really glad to have you. I've coveted your input on this as one of two members of the Legislative Black Caucus in the California State Senate, and hope we have the chance to talk again. But thank you for joining us.
Absolutely, and thank you so much for taking up this conversation, this issue. Appreciate you. Let's do more.
State Senator Lola Smallwood-Cuevas of Los Angeles. And that closes this edition of Then There's California. We're a production of the California State Senate Democratic Caucus with technical assistance and production support from John Roman, Eric Robertson, Michelle Baker, McLeana Woods, Marvin Richardson, Ariana Medell, and the graphic design artistry of Tim Davis. On behalf of State Senators Stephen Bradford and Lola Smallwood-Cuevas, I'm Brian Green from the state capitol in Sacramento. Thank you for listening to Then There's California.